The protocells also reproduce far differently than modern ones.
Where in your TARDIS can you show us this evidence, Doctor Who?
As mentioned before, they grow.
Grow? Into what? What did the little non-existent man in charge of the DNA factory have them grow into?
The lipid membrane that they're covered in can only expand to a certain size.
So the non-existent man in charge of the factory got smart and said, let's make a switch to turn this off, or we won't have a giant idiot contemplating his navel with all the wisdom of the universe in his head before he becomes eaten by maggots?
Even if new lipids are accumulated,
even if... Boy, that non-existent man in charge of the DNA factory grew some brains pretty fast, didn't he? It couldn't have been before the DNA came into symbiosis with the lipid bilayer, true? But once it got inside, it had to quickly evolve a switch to shut down the factory, true? But you don't want to believe God would do that, do you? You have to believe tumbling around in the vent or lying on a special ancient sea floor did that, huh?
Even if new lipids are accumulated, after it gets too big to contain itself, the membrane begins to rupture.
Oh, so it had to evolve an off switch and evolve it damn fast, so no smart guy with wisdom feeding maggots, huh?
The protocell is divided, and a line starts to form in the middle of it.
Since I'm going to ask, if you're going to say the complexity of the code in the DNA strand telling it to flip a switch to create such a line, you respond and say, not line, it just cracks into two. Is that all? Is that it? True? Because to say it's complex to form such an action seems to imply God, true?
Effectively splitting it in half.
And you don't call that, and you don't want to say that as complex, do you? You can't say it is. True?
Then the lipids pull apart, creating two new, smaller protocells of the one.
Due to the information on the DNA telling the man in charge of the factory to do such a thing. If there is no personal God, why should the man in charge of the factory care that the bubble forms two bubbles to keep from making one huge bubble that would burst? I bet you don't want to go there, do you? If you're an atheist, I can imagine you wouldn't.
The lipids still naturally form micellary.
Which is just a naturally forming bubble. Got it. Something complex but not complex. And if I asked you'd say, well, what's complex, right? And if I brought up a wind-up toy, then you'd then get off and say a wind-up toy can't self-replicate as a way to change the subject, wouldn't you?
Well, the lipids will still naturally form micellary, so the spot where the split occurred is instantly repaired.
Due to the information on the DNA, or due to the non-existent man in charge of the DNA factory inside the lipid bubble? Which is it? If it's on the DNA that it should repair, how should it get into the DNA for that to happen, and why? You don't want to go there again, do you?
Mutation still happens strictly within an individual protocell.
Yes, but what caused the mutation in the DNA factory to save the lipid bubble in time? And again, why should it have even bothered to want to mutate to even make such a repair? Wouldn't it have been just fine to go out like a little cold supernova? If not, again, how did jostling about in a thermal vent or sitting on a seafloor make it want to mutate and not go out like a little cold firework, popping into nothing with a bunch of worthless DNA globs of matter floating around it? What in that long DNA strand would say, hey, little guy in charge of the DNA factory, let's cool it on the replicating me till this bubble pops. Let's add an off switch to my genetic code, okay? Hey, better yet, I'm going to mutate to add a bunch of switches so we can have this thing form a line, crack, and divide and make two of us, and so on and so forth, to the point where some genius is able to make a playground for maggots in a lot of gray matter. Why did DNA evolve those switches and not want to go poof in that ancient sea? You don't want to say God, I bet.
Well, as I said, mutations still happened, strictly with individual cell. If it didn't want to.
Doesn't that mean intelligence? Certainly you, as an atheist, don't want to use that sentence, do you? DNA isn't supposed to want anything, right? Aren't you saying the DNA is God with such a sentence? Man, whoever thought being inside a lipid bilayer bubble could be so enlightening?
This splitting allowed for more opportunity.
Opportunity to not want to be a piece of sin, tumbling about in the surf, but opportunity to become someone, becoming a husband or wife, loving, supporting, caring for the spouse before being reduced to a maggot playground. I see.
Over the next billion years, the protocells developed into cells.
What? You mean you weren't describing the functioning of a cell? Well, what was this, quote, DNA making factory, in quote, stuff evolving switches to make two bubbles that didn't pop? Oh, but that's not complex to have such switches in a DNA strand to mutate such a mechanical system, Mr. Atheist? It took the next billion years of being jostled in a vent or lying on an ancient seafloor for that, to produce something that so far can't even be duplicated in a laboratory,
Well, then into bacteria, slowly getting more and more complex as the population retained itself.
Bacteria that could only come about by being jostled in and out of vents or lying peacefully on an almost magical seafloor. Didn't the stuff you just described earlier fit the characteristics of a bacterium? What made the DNA evolve switches to make the lipid bilayer form two bubbles before exploding with a bunch of worthless, self-replicating DNA that somehow survived long enough in a hostile environment before entering the, quote, protective, unquote, shelter of a bubble lipid bilayer where it would then quickly evolve switches to make two bubbles to keep from exploding? Oh, but don't talk about God, Mr. Atheist? No, don't talk about God here, right?
Oh, this is where abiogenesis ends, and evolution begins to take total control of the destiny of life on Earth.
Where the magic ends and talk of the problem of eye formation and mice-like creatures ending up with big webbed hands for no apparent reason. Plants quickly evolving fly-catching leaves to keep from starving in nitrogen-depleted environments, all the while trying to avoid why they should evolve when death and oblivion waits them anyway.
The protocells are believed to be the first life to form on Earth.
Oh, really? Not a long strip of DNA somehow surviving a hostile environment before entering a, quote, protective, unquote, symbiotic environment inside a bubble, totally ignoring how a long strand of self-replicating DNA is going to be able to get inside a bubble with those little tiny holes, get inside a protective bubble and quickly evolve switches and levers to not only shut down DNA reproduction, but to make it so the bubble will divide without spilling worthless DNA strands out into the sea. Really?
Protected cells believed to be the first life on Earth. All that was needed was a little chemistry.
Oh, yeah, and all you need to watch a movie on videotape is a little physics. But the information on that videotape didn't get there by accident, did it, Mr. Atheist?
And a lot of time.
This is your God, if you're an atheist. Far easier to say time might have come about in such a way than think of an eternal God, Mr. Atheist?
The process happened over 1 billion years, and it all has been proven time and time again to happen naturally.